Midway upon the journey of life, I found myself in a dark wood where the right way was lost. Dante's Divine Comedy provides a grand education in the proper order of the human soul and the order of the cosmos. An epic poem in 3 parts, it tells the story of Dante's journey through the afterlife. Through his account of the afterlife, Dante reveals universal truths about character and choice, the nature of God and man, and the path to freedom and happiness. Welcome to the Great Conversation podcast. I'm your humble host, Adrian Joseph, and today I am equally honored and delighted to be joined by Dr. Jamie McGregor from Rhodes University to discuss Dante's Divine Comedy. Dr. McGregor teaches English literature at Rhodes University, specializing in the fields of modernism, romanticism, fantasy, and the epic. Furthermore, he has published numerous articles on J.R.R. Tolkien and is currently working on a full-length study of Wagner's operas, as well as a popular guide to Dante. Professor, welcome to the Great Conversation podcast, and thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Before we get into unpacking the developments of the Divine Comedy, 2 perhaps introductory questions would be instructive. There are so many ways to take this poem as story, history, philosophy, theology, and politics. So my first question then is, are we to take Dante's story as an imaginative fiction or as an allegory of religious truth? In other words, isn't the allegorical intention that he states more properly a moral intention?
That's a great place to start, Adrian. I would say for most readers, especially today in a largely post-Christian world, it makes sense to approach the comedy as a story, first and foremost. And I don't think that is wildly divergent from what Dante had in mind. Obviously, it's a great religious allegory at the same time, but it's so successful and it stood the test of time because of the packaging, so to speak, the fact that this wealth of ideas has been communicated through the vehicle of an exciting story full of lost souls and monsters and fabulous underworld geography and so on. You know, it has all the right ingredients, much as a successful fantasy novel might in our own time, to hook the reader and really capture the imagination and take you on a journey. And I think that is where its popular appeal lies to this day, and one can get to the deeper ideas through the story first and foremost.
You talk there about the diversity of the characters and events. There is a sense in which the characters and the events in the Divine Comedy have what could be described as a multiplicity of meaning: historical, fictional, moral, and spiritual. So persons and things are then to be taken both in a literal sense, but also in a symbolic sense. And there is a sense in which the Divine Comedy is a tremendous work that no reader can fully grasp in a single reading, because Dante takes everything from the nature of man, the world, and God, and he welds all this disparate material into a unified whole. I think now is time for our second question, and this touches on our first question, which is the idea of the Divine Comedy and Christianity. Does the appreciation of the Divine Comedy require an acceptance of the Christian view of things? Obviously, there are all kinds of literary qualities in the comedy that can be appreciated apart from its basic view of man's nature and destiny. But some commentators would say that this disjunction between meaning and art with Dante is not always possible. So, in your opinion, is it possible that we can accept the Divine Comedy in a comprehensive sense as a story of this worldly account of man's moral development and experience, apart from the Christian view of reality?
Yes, very much so. I mean, that's certainly my view. I make that quite decisively. At the same time, you know, I would acknowledge that plenty of people, many scholars far more authoritative than myself might readily disagree. And I would even go so far as to say perhaps secular readers such as myself are missing a certain dimension of the poem. But even if that is the case, there is more than enough left over. And my own experience of reading and attempting to guide students to an understanding of Dante's story as well is centered in the translation of his allegory into terms that make sense for day-to-day living. Really, it's surprising how right from the outset, with the famous opening that you started with of Dante coming to his senses lost in the dark wood, how any reader immediately on opening the first canto is going to connect with that surely and say, well, here is the midlife crisis. All right, so whenever and wherever one comes from in time and history and encounters this poem, regardless of one's belief system or background or worldview, or how much or how little one might have in common in detail with Dante's worldview, there is something so universal at work that I think it cuts through all those kinds of potential divisions and boundaries. And that's not only true immediately of the opening, but of almost every stage. I mean, if one thinks of Inferno, there are certainly, there are, let's say, more theologically laden areas in hell, such as the circle of heresy, or the subdivision that deals with the Simonists in the eighth circle. These are very specific and particularly medieval religious categories that perhaps don't translate as easily for the modern reader. But most of it, you know, your standard deadly sins, anger, pride, lust, and all the rest of them, and so on, are of course immediately recognizable to every human being.
It is sometimes described as the greatest midlife crisis in the Western literary tradition. And so in that sense, it is accessible to everyone who is lost in their own, or can find themselves lost in their own dark wood. But let's maybe put the idea of the link between Christianity and Dante aside for the moment and talk rather about man's moral development. And I want to read something from that Dante put in a letter to one of his patrons, wherein he outlines the idea that the Divine Comedy, its aim is prophetic rather than aesthetic, in the sense that Dante's aim is to edify, it is to awaken his readers morally through appealing to their minds and hearts by means of his own literary power, to put into verse things difficult to think, as he says. And let me maybe read from the letter what Dante wrote. And here we get Dante saying that the real subject of the work is man's freedom of choice and his responsibility for his moral attainments or his failings. Quoting Dante, the subject of the whole work, taken merely in its literal sense, is the state of souls after death, considered simply as a fact. But if the work is understood in its allegorical intention, the subject of it is man, according as, by his deserts and demerits in the use of his free will, he is justly open to rewards and punishments. And so here we have Dante almost warning us or telling us that you must, to understand the Divine Comedy, we must go out and seek the underlying meanings of the work and not be merely satisfied with the superficial, the dramatic surface of the story. Do you have any comments on that?
I remember reading that letter, of course, a few times. It's included in any good introduction. And I think that passage is particularly illuminating. And I think this connects very nicely to a term that is taken from the poem itself. The Dante's original word is contrapasso. It is used in the context of it's one of the sinners in the eighth circle, Bertrand de Born, who is one of the more memorable figures visually. He's the one who holds up his own severed head like a lantern And he invites Dante to observe in himself the figure of this concept of divine retribution for sin. And it's very clear in that example, but in so many others as well, that the nature of individual punishments that are catalogued so exhaustively in Inferno are symbolic of the spiritual states themselves. So Bertrand, for example, is there because he was a warmonger, and specifically in his case, he divided a kingdom by turning the son against the father, the young king against the old king. So his decapitation is very obviously symbolic of that. And there are many other examples equally clear in the course of the story. And how I think this is helpful in considering the idea you put to me there is that because we're concerned here with free will, as you said, is this kind of approach to the representation of sin and punishment really cements the idea that it isn't simply the wrath of an offended God who is doing these terrible things to human sinners, that they really are doing it to themselves. That what you see in the punishment is simply the symbolic representation of the sin itself, so that sin and punishment become one. And the idea, I think, is quite psychologically penetrating. That, I mean, one can compare it, centuries later to Dostoevsky, that what you do to other people, you do to yourself, might be the neatest way of putting this.
I think it is in Plato's Republic that we have Socrates saying that it is better to suffer an injustice than to be unjust yourself, because the person who commits an injustice harms not just the person whom he commits the injustice against, but also stains his soul through the committing of the injustice. But maybe let's move on now to get into the meat of the poem. The Divine Comedy begins with those famous lines, which I started at the podcast in the discussion with. Frightened and confused by the dark and tangled wood, Dante tries to find his way back to the right way from which he has strayed. He attempts to climb a hill whose summit is lit by a rising sun, but three wild animals, a leopard, a lion, and a wolf, prevent him from doing so. And so he appeals for aid to a passing figure, which turns out to be the shade of Virgil, who Dante reveres as a master of the poetic art. But many readers here have an immediate question, which is, why must Dante first descend into the Inferno in order to save himself? Why can he not simply just ascend the mountain that he sees in the first canto? Why is it necessary for the development of the plot in the story, as it were, for Dante first to descend before he can ascend the mountain?
Wonderful question, Adrian. I think the answer has to do, again, not simply with the story, but what it means, and what it means to a modern reader in psychological terms, because this really makes sense. And I think it's even underlined by the fact that Dante, in a sense, tries to go straight to purgatory. Because if you remember, he's trying to climb a hill into the sunlight, out of the dark wood. And of course, eventually, in the sequel, when he gets to Purgatory, that turns out to be a great mountain that he has to climb. And it's clearly a composite symbol of the road to salvation that is the complete antithesis of hell, figured as a vast underworld pit. So you have the suggestion that Dante's immediate impulse is to improve his situation, whereas what we have in hell is seemingly the opposite. Why would anyone want to go there from bad to worse? And of course, the moral object lesson of going through hell is to learn from the example of all the people who have ended up going the wrong way altogether. But it isn't simply that. It's the fact that, and I think this is something that is underlined throughout the story by Dante's own human fallibility, his sense of connection with many of the damned, and his sense of sympathy for them. that it's not simply other people, it's the potential in ourselves. And Dante, of course, functions in his own story as a stand-in for the reader, a kind of everyman figure. So we see in his journey through hell a potential for ever worse moral failing in each and every one of us. And it's only through encountering that and the possibility of going from bad to worse that you can. I've described this as a form of literary aversion therapy. You have to really take a good, long, hard look at yourself to see, just how bad things can get before you can really start to do the work of making yourself better. That seems to be, in psychological terms, why hell has to precede purgatory in the course of the story.
I take your point there. There seems to be the sense in which suffering must be a necessary part of any sort of repentance. And you mentioned there that Dante represents every man in a way. And I think we can identify here in Canto 2 with Dante's doubts about whether he's able to undertake the journey. He fears that he lacks the courage and the necessary stature to go forth. And Virgil then goes on to rebuke Dante for his cowardice and then convinces him to begin the journey by revealing that he has been sent, that is Virgil now, by Beatrice. And I'll maybe want to read Canto 2 here to the readers, a portion from Canto 2. This is Dante speaking, lines 31 to 42 in Canto 2. But I, who grants my coming, and for what? I'm not Aeneas, I'm not St. Paul. No one, not I myself, could think me worthy. So if I should enter on this quest, I fear it would be mad and foolish. But you're wise, you understand more than my words can say. And as a man who unwills what he will, changing his plan for every little thought, till he withdraws from any kind of start, so did I turn my mind on that dark verge, for thinking ate away the enterprise, so prompt in beginning to set forth. And there we have in Dante, that is something I think we can also associate with the indecision of the start, of trying to, if we are trying to engage in some sort of moral improvement, it's almost an idea of inertia. It's more difficult to get the journey underway. But once we are underway, as you say in Dante, the narrative then seems to flow of its own accord.
Yeah, it's a wonderful passage. That there's a real revelation of Dante's humanity as a character and of his self-awareness. Notice how Dante as narrator, their comments on Dante as character and his own moral shortcomings, and really exposes himself as making excuses for his own cowardice and inertia, as you put it.
Indeed. And now I think we can move on to some of the main incidents in Dante's journey through hell to try and get a clear picture of the way in which hell is arranged. Over the entrance gate to hell are inscribed the words, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." And it is something that I think would be quite funny to have inscribed above the archway to a lecture theatre for first years. It would, if they got the reference, that would be an interesting way to welcome them. But putting that aside for the moment, you mentioned just briefly the importance of confession in hell and what type of confessions we hear. You spoke about the contrapasso and so on. So before we talk about Dante's interaction with Francesca, what is important about the structure of the confessions in hell, and what do they reveal not only about Dante's interlocutors, but about Dante's nature himself?
That's a very interesting question again, Adrian. And it seems that there is an element of irony involved to an extent, because one perhaps doesn't expect to find confession in hell. One associates the act of confession with the penitent sinners, whereas those who end up eternally lost are unrepentant and self-condemned. As a result, the nature of those who confess in hell is quite an interesting puzzle in itself. And there is Guido de Montefeltro, much later, whom T.S. Eliot quotes at the beginning of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And in those lines, he's saying if he thought that whoever he was speaking to could return to the world and share his story, then not a word would pass his lips. And he's taken in because he assumes that Dante is a damned soul like himself. And so the confession is not meant to be shared outside the confines of hell in his case. So it's a very, very complicated business, this of why the damned confess, what they think they're confessing, and what they're really revealing about themselves.
Coming back to Francesca and the nature of confessions, there is something interesting about the crucial theme of confession in Dante's Inferno. And this is that the infernal confessions tend to be inaccurate, they tend to be evasive, and they tend to be self-centered. And we see this in Dante's interaction with Francesca. We have the touching story of Paolo and Francesca, who gave way to their desires when reading a love story together. And this story really does bring out the nature of sin in a concrete and a touching way. But when Dante addresses Francesca, her answer reveals two things to us, and we'll read her answer shortly. But her confession reveals two things, namely her self-centeredness, but also the false understanding of God which she presents to Dante. Self-centered because she assumes Dante has traveled all this way just to meet with her and hear her confession, but also a false understanding of God because she wrongly characterizes God as the enemy of human desire. She talks about the power of the book they were reading and by extension, the irresistible power of love itself. And Dante, who is a fellow lover of poetry and human beauty, as we said earlier, is so overcome that he faints to the ground. So reading in Canto 5 in the Inferno lines 121 through 138. One day, we two were reading for delight about how love had mastered Lancelot. We were alone and innocent and felt no cause to fear. And as we read, at times we went pale as we caught each other's glance, but we were conquered by one point alone. For when we read that the much longed for smile accepted such a gentle lover's kiss, this man, whom nothing will divide from me, trembled to place his lips upon my mouth. A pander was that author and his book. That day we did not read another page. And so I think there is a very interesting, and you might want to comment on that. This is sort of the quintessential explanation of the nature of the confessions that we see throughout the Inferno.
Yes, no, and your own commentary on the passage, Adrian, needs no improvement from me. I think you really described that very compellingly, and this is, I think, the clearest object lesson for the reader of what you were describing. That is the false and self-deceiving confession, because it's very clear as one reads Francesca's story. Well, two things, of course, are that it is superficially engaging the reader as it does Dante, and it comes out of this medieval tradition of courtly romance and of human love as this exalted feeling that is transformative in nature. And everything about it seems wonderful and deeply human and sympathetic. And I think we are meant to respond in this way and to feel, well, of course, we would all choose the same, wouldn't we? And it's self-justifying. But then the other thing that one notices if one reads just a little more carefully, and this was very clear in your reading, Francesca never actually takes accountability or responsibility for her own choices at all. It's always fate or God, or it's the panda who wrote the book that they read, or it's her lover, Paolo himself, because he's so irresistible. It's always something else making her do it, and it's overpowering. And again, this is very clever on Dante's part, because people who have been in love will recognize this psychological experience of overwhelming, irresistible desire. But is it really, or is the element of choice and free will not always central? And it's very interesting in what you said as well, how close Francesca's experience of damnable love is to Dante's own experience of love that is in fact redeemable. In a sense, one can say that Francesca's conception of love is a parody of what it should be.
We know also that Dante also wrote a short book called the La Vita Nuova, which recounts his love for Beatrice, which resembles Francesca's love, at least in the initial understanding, as being this sort of over-the-top, powerful love that completely subsumes, or rather subverts, the idea of human agency or free will. We're going to come to Dante's representation of Satan. And this is often a time when readers are quite surprised surprised at Dante's depiction of Satan. And they are surprised really because we see a giant picks up Dante and Virgil and sets them down in the lower levels of fraud, which are the lowest levels of hell, and who are reserved for those who have committed fraud against intimates. This is where they are punished. And this is then divided again into 4 concentric rings on a frozen river or a lake, which is at the very bottom of hell, which is at the point furthest from light and warmth. And so, Professor, my question then is, should we be surprised then by Dante's representation of Satan? And what does his depiction of Satan teach us about the nature of sin?
Surprised in what way?
Surprised in the sense that we are currently in the Inferno, and a lot of people associate hell and the Inferno with burning or heat, warmth, those sorts of things. And yet here we have Satan, the chief sort of character in the entire Inferno, but he is sort of bound in ice with 3 faces. He's buried at the bottom of hell up to his waist in ice. And don't you think in that sense that this would be a surprising depiction of Satan for first-time readers?
Yes, I see exactly what you mean now. Of course, hellfire has become proverbial for perfectly natural reasons, of course. Infernal punishments have always been associated with the burning above all. And there's a certain irony, in fact, that we even have the popular saying, when hell freezes over, which I think is normally uttered in blissful ignorance of the fact that this is exactly what happens in Dante's version of hell, and that the worst of his sufferings reserved for. And again, this has to do with what we were saying earlier about the contrapasso idea, the choice of deliberately symbolic punishments. So we have the example of Bertrand de Born's severed head. It begins much earlier. Francesca and the other adulterous lovers, of course, are swept through the second circle on a great wind, which is immediately recognizable as a symbol of uncontrolled desire. And so one has example after example. Fire itself is used in various ways, in various other subdivisions. But the lake of ice at the bottom is perfect. The punishment of cold works so well symbolically in terms of what it represents, this ultimate sin of treachery, of repaying good with evil. One again, as a modern reader, one might think of the kind of people who end up in this circle as recognizably psychopathic, people without the least shred of humanity or compunction or brotherly love or any of these things, people who are, we might say, proverbially cold inside or icy-hearted. Again, it's very interesting how much Dante's symbolism has in common with proverbial turns of speech.
A great question now would be, what kind of hero is Dante? Or what kind of character does Dante make of himself in the Divine Comedy? Is he a paragon, the paradigm of virtue, or does he put himself more ordinarily on the human scale with quite a few weaknesses? Is Dante bold and determined, or in the beginning here, is he timid and indecisive? And what do the various spiritual and moral failings of Dante, we spoke about his inability or his indecisiveness at the start, the fact that he sympathizes with Francesca, even though her confession is not ideal. Does that make him every man? Does that allow us to relate with Dante?
Yes, absolutely. I think again you've gone some way towards answering your own question. I think it's very clear to most readers that he is the kind of hero that you described. Secondly, he is an everyman figure in a sense. Of course, he is still Dante, the great poet, and he doesn't show any false modesty about that either. If you remember, right at the beginning, on entering hell for the first time in the first circle, which is limbo, Virgil is welcomed by other classical poets of antiquity, and Dante is welcomed among them, and he himself comments on this, that he is made one of their fellowship. So this is a kind of suggestion that he knows his own worth as a poet of the highest rank. So that sets him apart from the average reader. But in all other respects, he is, I think, more effective as a character for being winningly human and fallible. So the portrait that emerges here of Dante as character is certainly one the reader can relate to and who doesn't appear to take himself too seriously. And another interesting way this works is because, well, again, partly what's being referenced, I think, in that earlier attempt to refuse the call to adventure that you referred to earlier, where he says to Virgil, well, I'm not St. Paul, I'm not Aeneas, I'm not worthy. Why me? What he's doing here, he's referring to the fact that, well, as in the example of the Aeneid, it is a great hero who has an appointed destiny to fulfill, who is the subject of an epic poem. Virgil writes about Aeneas. Virgil doesn't write about himself. So Dante is doing something very original in making himself the hero of his own epic. And that's a very daring strategy as well, because it seems on the face of it to be a kind of arrogant gesture. But it's counteracted, I think, by the way that he makes himself so small and human. And perhaps there's a deeper point as well. Perhaps this is a way of saying that any one of us can, in fact, and should qualify for this kind of quest, that it is the journey of everyone.
It's quite similar, actually. You talk about the originality of Dante's self-insertion into his work. This is something that mimics what a lot of great painters do. So, for example, Botticelli, who places himself in his own painting. Maybe there is something interesting and original about the way that Dante goes about it. But coming to Purgatory now, Purgatory is an essential part of the Divine Comedy. It belongs between hell and paradise, just as repentance belongs between sin and redemption, at least in the Christian scheme of things. But Dante's Purgatory is a lot more neatly and systematically arranged, you could say, than his hell. We saw that hell served as a journey of necessity for Dante, who begins the poem lost in a dark wood and lacking in knowledge of himself, but his education is not yet complete. He now understands how desires can go wrong, but yet he still has to be further corrected and refined to see what human beings are created for, or rather what their purpose is. When they come to the entrance of Purgatory, there's an angel sitting at the entrance with a sword in his hand, and Dante and Virgil mount 3 steps, and Dante then goes on his knees and humbly begs the angel to open the gate. The angel then inscribes 7 P's on Dante's forehead, which are linked to the 7 deadly sins. And but before we go on to discuss the imagery of the 3 steps a bit more and what these 7 P's mean, could you maybe tell us what your interpretation is of the angel guarding the gate, and what does the angel's discussion with Dante and Virgil tell us about how Purgatory will be different from the Inferno?
Very interesting point of comparison, Adrian. That's clearly it's a high point, and it's marked because it doesn't come right at the beginning. As you'll remember, we have several cantos of what's called anti-purgatory, first of all, where various late repentant souls have to wait for some centuries, I think, before they can get in to purgatory proper, to begin their purgation. So there's a kind of build-up to this moment of entering the gate. And by now, the reader of the Purgatorio has enough experience to recognize that what we're seeing in the ascent of this mountain is again, it's kind of the mirror image of what we have with the descent into the great pit of hell. And there also, of course, we were used to this pattern of encountering guardians of the various circles and of having to pass gateways and so on. You remember there's a major division in hell between the upper circles and the lower ones in the great city of Dis. So there's a kind of a mirror image going on here as we're being inducted further into the process of self-overcoming and repentance, which really begins at this point. So the angel sits at the threshold, and he's also clearly, with the flaming sword, a counterpart of the scriptural references to the angel who drives Adam and Eve out of paradise in the first place. And of course, Dante links his conception to scriptural source material because, as you know, when we finally get to the top of the mountain, after the 7 terraces devoted to purging each of the deadly sins, what we find is the Garden of Eden itself, situated at the summit of this mountain. So the angel, in that sense, is traditional, and he's here to make sure, of course, as you really clarified in your question already, that Dante is now ready, that he is prepared to fully submit himself, that he has learned enough on the journey already. And this reminds us of what we said a bit earlier as well, that why it was necessary to go through hell first, that there's in fact a great deal of preparation involved before. And Purgatory is, well, it's my favorite part of the whole poem, because it has some point. What you see in hell is very entertaining in a kind of sadomasochistic way, I suppose. But what do you get from it? You just get examples of what not to do. But the focus of Purgatory is much more positive and relatable in terms of a kind of self-improvement exercise. Whereas when we eventually get to the Paradiso, it's reserved for the saints, and most of us can't relate to that very easily either.
One thing that will help us along in our conversation is this idea of, and it's a discussion that Virgil has in his discourse on love in Canto 17, where he talks about love distorted, love defected, and love excessive as the different ways of explaining the nature and the structure of purgatory. And so maybe that should be our next focus. Let me read from Canto 17, lines 91 to 96. This is Virgil. Not the creator, nor a single creature, as you know, ever existed without love. The soul's love, or the love that comes by nature. The natural love is just and cannot rove. The soul's love strays if it desires what's wrong, loves with too much strength, or loves not enough. This excerpt that I've just read helps explain the structure of Mount Purgatory. We have Virgil's discussion here on love, explain how love goes wrong. And so we see the bottom 3 terraces dedicated to purging the love that desires what is wrong. So if you look at your map, that will be pride, envy, and wrath. And the bottom terrace, I think, addresses pride, because pride is seen as the parent of all other sins. We have penitents going around in a circle with a stone on their back, uttering the Lord's Prayer. And then we have the excessive lovers, who are the closest to paradise. They love the wrong things, and so they are furthest away. And so I think the structure of purgatory helps us, gives us a solution to our problem, or the solution to our question, that it differs from hell in that the problem of hell is not to get rid of desire, but rather to learn how to govern desires correctly, or how to govern desires well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, thanks, Adrian. I'm so glad you focused in on this passage in particular, because I share your instinct here. I think this is really the key to unlocking everything. This focus on the centrality of love to Dante's whole conception. And already we've prepared part of the ground for this in our discussion about Francesca earlier. We've already seen how she functions as an example of defective love, in a sense. It's so interesting, and it's so logical when you really look at what is being said about how love goes wrong, and how each of the 7 deadly sins are now interpreted as perverted or excessive forms of love, because that seems initially surprising and counterintuitive to a reader. How can sin be understood as a form of love at all? But in fact, it makes very good sense, and I think it derives in part from an idea Dante might have known from Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy, that evil has no substance, that everything in the universe originates with goodness. So sin and evil are not essences in themselves. They are merely distortions, diseases, in a sense, of the good. And this makes such sense. So pride, the example you started with, one sees as self-love that has become inflated to a dependence on others' subordination. If you are eaten up by pride, you are eaten up by your own self-will. You want to put all others down. So this is a very clear example of how, as you said, love for the wrong thing has taken the place of love for the right and natural thing. And you're quite right. Well, pride was always, from the days of the early church fathers, I think, understood as the first and greatest of sins, and the sin particularly associated with the rebellion of Lucifer, and being especially primal in that sense. And in Dante's view of it, also as logically worse than any others. And I think part of the way that works is because it's self-justifying. All other sins need an excuse, but pride is its own excuse. Because if you're proud, you do as you will, not as God wills, not as others will, not with any consideration for any other set of values. So this is the most difficult to overcome. So it has to be tackled first, and then we proceed up the stages of the mountain. And then again, as you said, the last one, lust is one of the sins of excess, because the object of love, the erotic desire, in itself is wholly a part of human nature. So this is not an ill in itself. It is rather something that needs to be managed in the appropriate way. And again, we're immediately reminded of Francesca again, and the fact that she wasn't really being punished for love or lustful desire, pure and simple, but from an inability to manage it correctly and even to take accountability for it, as we saw. And this is part of what has to be learned by the penitent lustful. And so we've looked at two examples of the seven, but they kind of frame all the others, and they give you the overall pattern.
This is one of the, in my opinion at least, this is one of the instances where Virgil proves himself to be an excellent guide, and that he gives us in a few lines an excellent summary, the spark notes, if you will, of what Purgatory is about and the structure of Purgatory. But we want
much better than spark notes.
Yeah, indeed. We're going to fast forward to a scene where Dante is terrified because it becomes necessary for him to get through a fire or a wall of fire that leads to earthly paradise. And here again, we have a scene which brings out fully the guiding and the supporting role of Virgil. I mean, we have the ancient master reassuring Dante that the fire will not destroy him. He tells him to dip his hand in the flame to test it if he has any doubt. When Dante refuses to budge, Virgil then summons up the name and, by extension, the image of Beatrice. And then all of a sudden, Dante's reluctance is softened at the mention of the name of his beloved, and they are able to pass through this purging fire. And so perhaps I'll read from Canto 27 before I give you my next question. So we're at Canto 27, various excerpts. So did he say to us when we drew near, and I was like a corpse put in the grave, and the words I heard so touched my heart with fear. I joined my hands and stretched them to the flames, gazing, seeing too sharply in my mind bodies I'd seen die burning at the stake. My worthy guides then turned around to me, and Virgil said, "My son, there may indeed be torment here, but death can never be. Now set aside all your fear. Be confident, come in." Yet I stood firm against my conscience. When he saw me stiffened and immovable, he said, a little troubled, "Son, look now. What's keeping you from Beatrice is this wall." I turned, my stiffness softened at that name that ever rises fresh within my mind. So, Professor, my question then is about the character and the role of Beatrice for people who are coming to the Divine Comedy for the first time. Who was Beatrice? What does she represent in the poem? again, we seem here to be confronted with this mixture of the literal and the symbolical, and we maybe get some indication of her role by the link or the connection between her name, Beatrice, and the Beatitudes, which also feature in the Purgatory. So what role does Beatrice play, not only for Dante, but in the Divine Comedy as a whole?
Well, a hugely important, really central role, of course, in many ways. Whether she was really, as the commentaries suggest, Beatrice Portinari, the young girl with whom Dante had fallen in love from the age of 9 already, I believe, and loved all her life till her early death, but in this decidedly idealized Platonic fashion, which is then celebrated in the poem by the fact that she is this figure from beyond the grave, who turns out to be the source, the cause, the motivation, all wrapped up of his quest in the first place. Because although he's only going to be meeting her again now, as he reaches the summit of the mountain and passes the last barrier of this wall of fire, which in itself is the last purgation of the sinners on the mountain. Those in the circle of lust are themselves burning off the last vestiges of earthly desire through this same flame that Dante must pass through in order to reach Beatrice. But this is the culmination of the whole journey, and we have known that Beatrice, in a sense, was the goal of that journey right from the beginning, because, of course, in the first encounter with Virgil, as part of what needs to happen for Dante to overcome that initial reluctance, Virgil has to explain that it was Beatrice who sent him in the first place. And again, as the commentaries would say, they share the role as Dante's guide. They are both his guide. Virgil is appointed, so to speak, as Beatrice's stand-in because he is not yet worthy to meet her in person. It is Virgil's role to take him on the first 2 legs of the journey. Just as you've said at the outset, Virgil is the figure of natural wisdom, virtue, reason, art, and culture. So Beatrice, of course, represents something higher, divine love itself, which is ultimately responsible for everything and the greater good of the sinner, here Dante, in not only providing him with the motivation to strive for, but actually out of its own benevolence, creating the opportunity for him to undertake the quest at all. So it's very, very interesting how Virgil is the first guide, Beatrice is the kind of ultimate guide who is even responsible for appointing Virgil as initial guide. And it is again and again the promise of meeting Virgil. I beg your pardon, Virgil's promise of Dante meeting Beatrice that helps him to overcome fear. And that's a pattern that was repeated throughout the Inferno. And the example that you've brought us to is really the culmination of this pattern. The last thing standing in Dante's way is this wall of flame. And the only thing that gets him over his hesitation is that he will not meet Beatrice any other way. So it comes down to something very simple in the end. What is sufficient to overcome the greatest possible fear? And that is only a still greater desire. And his greatest desire is to meet his true love again, and the vehicle of the true divine nature of love that Beatrice symbolizes.
Dante is quite smitten by his old flame of love that he has, like you've described, for Beatrice since he was a boy. And it's almost, he turns to confide in Virgil, and he finds Virgil, his beloved master, gone. And he cries for the first time since the angel wiped the tears of hell from his face. You mentioned the move. Virgil is often seen as an example or the symbol of knowledge, or of philosophical or of classical wisdom or knowledge, whereas Beatrice is seen as a more theological type of knowledge. Indeed, she actually chides Dante for the inadequacy of his philosophical knowledge to comprehend the mysteries which he will still go on to reveal to him. So I think this is a very important passage for understanding the whole work, because Beatrice is here rebuking Dante for not only betraying the high promise that he had as a poet, but she also draws from him a confession of his guilt at having, at having deserted the ultimate good, shall we say, for lesser goods, not necessarily evils, but lesser goods. And there's a wonderful part in Purgatory where Dante's weeping, or the melting of Dante's heart, again because this is a poem that rewards memory, and it points us back to the bottom of the pit of ice that we spoke about earlier. And maybe I can read that part. We're in Purgatory, Canto 30, lines 73 through 99. This is Beatrice speaking. Look at me well. I am Beatrice. I am she. How did you deign to come upon the hill? Didn't you know that man is happy here? As now among the living beams of trees upon the mountain spine of Italy, swept by the cold of Slavic winds will freeze. So was I too at first. No sighs, no tears, until the song of those who ever sing, following the notes of the eternal spheres. That ice, which gripped me hard about the heart, turned to water and breath, and with the stress, it came out through the mouth and through the eyes. And so here we have a link. We could almost say Dante is now ready. He's been purged. He can now begin his journey onto paradise, because we have this link between the imagery of the ice of Dante's heart and the ice that we spoke about earlier with Satan.
That's a really extraordinary parallel that you've managed to draw there, Adrian, and especially because one perhaps least expects the worst part of hell to still be lingering in Dante's heart after all that he's been through, and climbing all of the seven terraces, and passing even through the final fire that is only the encounter with Beatrice herself that melts the last vestiges of ice in his heart. Extraordinary suggestion that this is an act of grace, that this is something beyond Dante's own powers to achieve for himself. And it's extraordinary. I think many readers are surprised as well when they get this far to find that the long-awaited encounter with Beatrice that is built up to so far is far from an easy experience. That she is really strikingly hard on him, in chiding him repeatedly for just how unworthy his conduct really has been all along. Very interesting how the handover, so to speak, from Virgil to Beatrice is handled. You know, the relationship of Dante and Virgil has been central right through hell. It's at least 3/4 or so of the Purgatorio as well. Virgil has been on his guide all along, so well over half of the complete poem. That relationship has mattered, and it matters to the reader as well. One kind of senses the bond between master and pupil, and when that suddenly ends, when he turns around for the last time and Virgil isn't there anymore, it's strangely touching and affecting, but it also makes perfect sense in terms of the allegory. Virgil has fulfilled his purpose. He has done all that natural wisdom can do to conduct Dante to the point where he's finally ready, that something greater can take over.
But we now come to the final part of the Divine Comedy, which is Paradise. Again, yeah, we're going to discuss one interaction in Paradise that I think is representative of the entire mood of this section of the poem, and that is the interaction with Picarda. At the beginning of their ascent, Beatrice, who is now Dante's guide, tells Dante of the universal order in which all things have their place, and in which the eternal power holds the world together as its source, as it were. And she says, man's ascent to God is as natural as water's descent down a mountain. You know, man may go up instead of down, but it's not natural for him to do so. And then we come across Picarda, who occupies the lowest level of heaven because of her inconstancy. And we have a very interesting piece of dialogue here where she almost proclaims her acceptance of the divine will. Many people see this as, if we have to choose a line in the Divine Comedy in the entirety, which sums up the entire Divine Comedy, it is this idea, or this part where Picarda says, my will is now God's will, or blessedness is to be at one with God's will. And so let me read Canto 3 of Paradise, lines 64 through 75. This is Picarda speaking. But tell me, you are so happy here, do you desire a place of greater height, to see more, know more, and be held more dear? Sorry, that's Dante addressing Picarda. With the rest of those shades, she smiled a bit. Then with such gladness she replied to me, as a girl in the gleaming of first love, brother, The virtue of our charity brings quiet to our wills. So we desire but what we have, and thirst for nothing else. If we should feel a yearning to be higher, such a desire would strike disharmony against his will, who knows and who wills us here. So, Professor, do you agree? Would you say if we had to choose a line or a part of the Divine Comedy which expresses the entire idea of the Divine Comedy, do you think this is an apt description or summary of the Divine Comedy?
I think it's as good a choice as one can easily find. There are perhaps other contenders, but yes, this seems a very neat encapsulation of what the characters are talking about at this point. Of course, is the overcoming of human ego altogether, where one has no self-will, but only wills in accordance with the divine will.
Beatrice is actually quite quick to point out to Dante that we are not to take literally these physical levels of heavenly ascent. They merely indicate grades of spiritual grace. So all the inhabitants of paradise, in a sense, occupy the highest heaven together, even though they are touched in greater and lesser degrees by the eternal symbol. And so paradise becomes for Dante, as you've said, the realm of divine love, which descends on all its inhabitants, though in different degrees according to their spiritual level. And here we have almost, as I've said, a summary. We saw in hell was characterized by the absence of love. We moved on to purgatory, and we saw that purgatory was characterized by imperfect love. And now ultimately we come to paradise, and we see that creation, it must strive upwards from states of absent and defective love to a state of perfect love, which represents the ultimate end and resting place. We are a bit pressed for time, and there's so much in this poem that you can discuss, so many details you can discuss, but the paradise or paradiso, the entire poem, it ends with a moment of mystical vision in which you spoke about the whole order of things, in which the poet sees everything in its essential order. And even though he can't keep that vision in his earthly form, at least his desire and his will are now permanently at one with the love which moves all things. And I'll read that final part of the Divine Comedy, a famous canto. This is We in Paradise, Canto 33, lines 133 to 145. As a geometer struggles all he can to measure out the circle by the square, but all his conjugation cannot gain the principle he lacked. So did I stare at the strange sight to make the image fit the areole and see it enter there. But mine were not the feathers for that flight, save that the truth I longed for came to me, smiting my mind like lightning flashing bright. Here cease the powers of my high fantasy. Already were all my will and my desires turned, as a wheel in equal balance by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And so there we have the other competitor, maybe to Picarda's dialogue of the sort of summary of the Divine Comedy. I think it was in Inferno where you mentioned Eliot. And I think before we get on to a more personal question, I think it would be helpful to the viewers to maybe quote some of Eliot's observations in his essay, his brilliant essay on Dante. So Eliot says, the majority of poems one outgrows and outlives, as one outgrows and outlives the majority of human passions. Dante is one of those which one can only just hope to grow up to at the end of one's life. And here for us is a parallel between Dante's spiritual journey and our spiritual journey as we go through life and as we read this truly, truly great poem. So thank you very much, Professor. I think that's an excellent way to conclude. But before we end the podcast and the discussion, I want to ask you a more personal question, and that is, what is your favorite piece of literature, and why is it your favorite piece of literature? And then what are your hopes for the future, not only of a humanities education in South Africa, but of a literary education more broadly, as briefly as you can?
Oh, you put me on the spot there. Well, I'll do what I can. I have so many favorites. It's impossible to choose one. What you said about Eliot's view of Dante makes me feel, or reminds me, that I don't feel that I'm really beginning to appreciate him fully yet. He's one of the supreme literary challenges, and especially, of course, for those of us who don't know Dante. Really, we are only getting the shadow of Dante via translation. I have so many popular favorites. You mentioned my work on Tolkien earlier. Like many people who become lovers of modern fantasy, I warmed to The Hobbit, I think, first, very early in childhood, and then that love has stayed with me through the decades. So there's one of my earliest favorites is still with me. My thoughts on education. Well, I think the work that you're doing with this podcast in general, I'm very honored to have played a small role in it. But if you can continue creating this great conversation with scholars nationally, and bringing some of our real personal connection with these works that have stood the test of time in the here and now, in this latter day and age, and post-COVID, and in our own peculiar fraught context here at the southern tip of Africa, and you can make that conversation as accessible as I know we both want it to be to generation of readers growing up, then I think that's the most laudable aim, and is the direction that we all need to be moving in. I mean, we live among great suffering, and we are all impacted by it. And it's sometimes thought and suggested by many that, reading literature, especially from centuries ago and the other side of the world, is an indulgence we can ill afford. I would take the opposite view, that we avoid it at our peril, that these great works we're talking about are works forged in suffering, and which we can learn a great deal about how to meet it ourselves.
As Eliot says in the introduction to his essay on Dante, he says, genuine poetry, or Dante, is good in the sense in which all poetry is good, in that it communicates before it's understood. And so if I can quote from that essay, he says, it is better to be spurred to acquire scholarship because you enjoy the poetry than to suppose you enjoy the poetry because you have acquired the scholarship.
I couldn't agree more. We're all common men and common readers, and we should never forget that. And I think that's who Dante and the other greats write for as well.
Professor, thank you very much. I'm very grateful for you taking your time to lend us your expertise. But that is unfortunately all we have time for today on the Great Conversation podcast. To our listeners at home, please remember to subscribe to the podcast. Do not forget to share it with friends and family who have a potential interest in great literature. Also, tune in to next week's episode. We will be discussing the Confessions of St. Augustine. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.